Here we'll be looking at completing the square and the uses of completing the square. Now it's important to keep in mind that completing the square can only be done for quadratic expressions or quadratic equations. In other words, your equation or your expression should be in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c are constants. Now, if you don't have your expression or your equation in this form, then you can't complete the square, or you usually don't complete the square. So let's take the example 3x squared minus 24x plus 45. So when we complete the square, there's a series of steps that you have to go through to complete the square, and they will be the same every single time. So the first step is to isolate your variable terms. In this case, it's 3x squared minus 24x. We leave the constant term till the very end. So if we isolate the variable terms, I'll just put squared brackets around them. Now, to be able to complete the square, you need the coefficient of x squared to be 1. In this case, the coefficient of x squared is 3, which means the first thing we need to do is factor out the 3 from the squared brackets. So if we factor the 3 out, what we would get is 3 multiplied by x squared minus 8x. And then we close the squared bracket, and the constant term stays as it is. This constant term will only be used at the very end, so you can disregard it for these next few steps. Now that you've factored the 3 out and the coefficient of x squared is just 1, now you can complete the square. Now in this step, you have the 3, the squared brackets stay the same, but now your x squared becomes x, and what you do with this constant, which is the coefficient of x, you half that constant, so it becomes minus 4, and you square your bracket. Now, just to check what this would be if we expanded our bracket, what you would get is x squared minus 8x plus 16. However, we don't have a 16 in the previous line, which means to account for this extra constant term, we need to subtract 16. Now, in the case where it's a different expression, every time you'll notice that all you need to do is subtract the square of this number, and you will account for the constant term. Then after accounting for the constant term, you add 45 to the end. Now you're almost done, and all you need to do is expand the square brackets. So to do this, your 3 needs to multiply by this term and this term. So we would get 3x minus 4 all squared minus 48, and then plus 45. Now, since there's nothing else left to do, we can just collect like terms and bring the constants together. So this would become 3x minus 4 squared minus 3. And we have completed the square. Now, one of the uses of completing the square for quadratics is to find the turning points of a quadratic. In this case, our quadratic is a U-shape. So for this quadratic, what we would be doing is finding the minimum point, so the coordinates of the minimum point of this quadratic. How you would do that is, first you look at the constant within your bracket, and you just take the negative of that constant. So since our constant is negative 4, we take the negative of that, so our x-coordinate becomes 4. And our y-coordinate is the constant term outside of the brackets, which is just -3. So the coordinates of this minimum point would be 4, -3. So that's one of the uses of completing the square. Another use of completing the square, if this was in the form of an equation, is you would be able to find your values of x. So, for example, if we made this equation equal to 0, we would get 3x minus 4 squared minus 3 equals 0. Now that we have that, to solve for x, the first thing we do is add 3 to both sides. So we get 3x minus 4 squared is equal to 3. Then we divide both sides by 3. So we get x minus 4 squared equals 1. Then we square root both sides. Now, be careful when you're square rooting a constant term, because when we square root the left-hand side, we get x minus 4. But when we square root 1, the square roots of 1 are plus or minus 1. So we would actually have two equations, where this equation would be x minus 4 equals 1 and x minus 4 equals -1. So to solve both equations separately, we find that x is equal to 5 and x is equal to 3. And those are our answers. So to recap, uses of completing the square are to solve for the values of x or to find the turning point of a quadratic.